with your permission, welcome. My name is Maxime Schreier. I teach at Boston College and I direct the Davis Center project on Russian and Eurasian Jewry that we launched here last fall. And the project was made possible with the generous support of Genesis Philanthropy Group and also with the support of the Center for Jewish Studies here at Harvard. I am delighted to welcome Professor Patricia Herlihy, whom I will introduce momentarily, although she's such a legendary figure that she really does not need a formal introduction. I just want to tell you that this is the final event of our series that we started back in the fall, and I just want to mention the talks we've had this year and the people who spoke, because some of you I know attended them and some did not. And by the way, the recordings are available. If you wouldn't mind just sitting there, I'm sorry. The recordings are available on our website, audio and video. So we kicked off the project with Derek Pensler, who spoke about Herzl and his reception by Zionists in Russia and Eastern Europe. We then had a talk by Roman Katzman, which dealt with Russophone literature in Israel and its renaissance. We had a panel with Jeffrey Weidlinger and Irina Astashkevich, which focused on pogroms during the Russian Civil War. We then had an event that focused on the plight of Jewish-Polish refugees who survived in the Soviet Union when they were sent to the hinterlands, and that was by Ellen Friedman, and Joshua Rubinstein served as the discussant. And then more recently we had a presentation by Stefano Garzonio from Italy, who spoke about Russian Jews in Italy, particularly their cultural contributions, and Stanley Rabinovitz served as discussant. And just 2 weeks ago, we had an event that focused on Joseph Brodsky with Elendea Crawford-Teasley, her recent memoir on Joseph Brodsky. And finally, today, we have Pat Herlihy, who will be speaking to us about Jewish Odessa, trade, community, and culture in the port city. I should tell you that Patricia Herlihy really is one of the pillars of our intellectual and academic community here at the Davis Center at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. And in New England, she is Professor Emerita of History at Brown University, and she has made numerous contributions to the study of Russia, Ukraine, particularly her pioneering history of Odessa that came out in English in 1986, in Ukrainian and in Russian. Then her groundbreaking book, The Alcoholic Empire, Vodka and Politics in Late Imperial Russia, that came out in 2002. So the point of this is, Pat is one of those remarkable individuals with whom both travel and drinking becomes a true symposium.
Is this an expose or
yes, and I just want to tell you, if I may, Pat, take just 2 more minutes of your precious time, that Pat trained generations of American historians, cultural historians, and Slavicists. I can recollect one particular semester, which was my first semester in America, the fall of 1987, when at Brown I had the pleasure of learning from Pat in a course on Russian history. But as it turned out, a number of other people who became professionals and players in the field were also in that course, and that included Tim Snyder, Gabrielle Rosenfield, and my former classmate, my good friend Christopher Springer, who was one of the first Americans to visit Pyongyang and write a guide to it. So in other words, Pat's impact really goes far beyond this center and this city and this country. Pat, I'm really thrilled that you're here and that we can learn from you again. Please help me welcome Patricia Herlihy.
Well, thank you Maxine, you got your A at the and I'm sure most of you on the whole would rather be at the beach. But anyway, let's do what is promised, and I'm told by the press that now's the time to make my pitch while you're still awake. So all I'm going to say about the book is with regard to Jewish Odessa, in the interest of transparency, out of the 13 chapters, there are only 2 that mention Jews specifically. One is called Port Jews of Odessa and Trieste, and the other is called Jewish Writers of Odessa. Now there's chutzpah for you. I'm in the presence of the expert. But at any rate, those 2, but at least 5 others of the chapters discuss the Jewish experience of Odessa. So don't want you to think this book is entirely about Jewish Odessa, but there are things in there, should you be interested. Well, let's begin, as every good school marm should, with a map. I'm sure most, if not all of you, know exactly where Odessa is, but I'll refresh your memories here. Clearly, it's a modern map, and you can see that it's up there in the northwest corner of the Black Sea, the southernmost, or near the southernmost part, now that Crimea is gone, of Ukraine. And as I have allergy too, so if I croak through this, sorry. I'm not really literally croak, you know what I mean. Now, how did this come into the Russian Empire? Well, very briefly, the Empress Catherine II took that territory from the Turks in 1789, and 1792 the Turks, Ottoman Turks, acceded to the acquisition by treaty, and by 1794 she said, let there be a city there. Primarily she was interested in having bodies there to defend it militarily, because she had a suspicion that the Turkish Empire might want to come back, the Ottomans might want to come and take it back. It had been a Turkish fort. The fort itself was called New Moon, kind of romantic. The little village there was called Hajibay, very, very sparsely populated. So Elizabeth's first task was to attempt to anchor it down with bodies to defend it. And where was she going to get these bodies? Well, she, for one thing, kind of winked and said, should there be any runaway serfs, they will be given their liberty if they come to that area. But there weren't that many runaway serfs. And the reason she couldn't just make a proclamation to come to Odessa is because of serfdom, of course. The serfs were attached to the land. You just couldn't invite them to come and leave the land. So it was a population problem. That was one of her remedies to get a stream of population. Another one was to post all over Europe, literally in the equivalent of post offices, flyers saying, give me your tired, you're poor, and so on. German Mennonites who had been persecuted responded to this. Catholic Germans who were persecuted in other German territory came to it, some Swiss, a handful of Italians and West Europeans in general responded to this solicitation, but she sweetened it by offering free land in some instances, and certainly an exemption from military service, from taxation, from quartering of troops. Could get loans to build churches if they had a certain density of population. In other words, she had as many inducements as she could give economically to entice European settlers. She didn't have to advertise for the Greek merchants. They were close enough and recognized the opportunities for export of grain since at the same time she was acquiring even more land in that area, as we'll see in a moment. So between the colonists, the Europeans, and the Greek merchant families, which were followed pretty close behind them, were Italian. And these commercial firms were family enterprises. In other words, they had brothers distributed at various ports, Smyrna, Livorno, Marseille, even London, so that they had a tight connections in which they could have venture capital. One brother would lend to the other, or the entire family firm could stake a brother to a new spot, such as Odessa. So they came very quickly, and of course they brought their expertise, their family networks of information, where the grain was cheap and abundant, who needed it, and so on. So that was a very important stream of population to the area. Now, she also had in mind inviting Jews. Well, fortuitously, the partitions of Poland were coming to an end just about the time that she was founding Odessa. In fact, the Pale of Settlement, which is before your eyes, it's not the best map, but you'll have to accept it. The Pale of Settlement was as outlined in dark, as you can see, and right on top of the Black Sea is an area that she designated as Novorossiya, or New Russia, comprising Ekaterinoslav and Taurida, Kherson, and later Bessarabia. So this whole area, she wanted to invite the colonists from Europe, especially the German colonists, so that they could demonstrate good husbandry. But the Jews, obviously, she wanted for expertise in finance and in commerce in particular. But now, she didn't feel she could invite directly Jews to Odessa. First of all, there were so many of them in the Pale of Settlement. She wanted to select the commercially oriented ones in particular. So she very cleverly and indirectly decided to double the taxes on the former Polish Jews in the Pale of Settlement, or any Jews that were there for that matter, principally. You know, they went to bed one night as Polish Jews and got up the next morning and said, "My God, I'm a Russian Jew," after she partitioned the area. But at any rate, she decided to double tax them, but have New Russia free of commercial tax. So of course that was another inducement. She had some prisoners, Jewish prisoners of war, down in Moldavia or Wallachia, and she brought them to Odessa. In other words, she also disbanded some of the agricultural colonies and brought the Jews to Odessa. The best source is that the town of Brody, I don't know if you can make it out there, there's a line there on the left side near up to Volhynia. And there on the border of the Austrian Empire was the town of Brody, also called the Trieste, the second Trieste, not because it was located anywhere near a sea, but because of the expertise in commerce. Brody itself was 88% Jewish, and quite a wealthy community because it was a free city. That is, there weren't customs charged, there was free storage of goods, and a very brisk business between the Russian Empire and the Austrian Empire. So by 1830 or so, 300 Jewish firms from Brody went to Odessa. And even today, and those of you who know Odessa, or even probably from Odessa, can note the German names. And Babel himself, one of the Brody German, who they transplanted, or just his forebears. But at any rate, the conjunction of the settlement, both for military and commercial purposes, happened at a time when Europe had a very strong demand for grain, especially after the Napoleonic Wars, because of the destruction of agricultural lands, and then with the industrialization and urbanization of Western Europe, there was a larger demand for grain and less production. So Odessa was perfectly poised for the supply, and using the steppe lands that could be developed. They were pretty wild, empty land around Odessa at the time of acquisition, but you could add that to the fertile Ukrainian growing centers. So that is, in a way, how the Jews came to Odessa, not all by any means, but just as with the others, they were self-selecting. They had, most of them, not all of them, but in the early days, they had capital, they had entrepreneurial skills and commercial skills. And here is the city itself. Of course, it's a modern version, but you can get the contours. And if you can imagine it being on a bluff 200 feet above the Black Sea, and you see the wharf area, and most of what you're looking at is the center city. There's a circular road going around, as you can see, the center, and that's the Porto Franco Street. And that was the extent of the free port from 1819 to 59. The city was a free port, and beyond that road was not exempt from the customs duties. And I know there's an expert here on smuggling, and I hope, there he is, and he can tell us a lot more than I can about the smuggling activity that went beyond the Porto Franco Road there, in an area principally, as we'll see very soon, in fact, right now. Well, first of all, this is where everybody knows you're in Odessa. I'll come back to that in a minute, but it ain't, the Freeport was an opportunity for a lot of continued commerce, let's say, but not of the legal kind. Well, let's look at the other. The Grand Staircase was built. It was called the Grand Staircase then. It was built in 1837, not principally by Jews, but it's so iconic, I just had to show it. And also to show the wealth, really, even as early as 1837. I mean, that was quite an enterprise. And mostly made of Trieste limestone, which is odd because the city itself is limestone. And the catacombs are the diggings of the materials to construct most of the city, but apparently the ships coming from Trieste carried limestone as ballast, and when they came to take away the wheat. Now here's a more modern version that probably looked more familiar to you if you've been to Odessa, certainly not the 1837 version. And now, of course, you'll see it's called the Potemkin Steps, obviously, for the moving battleship Potemkin, the silent moving Eisenstein, in 1925. All right, now, here in Promenade of Jews in 1856, a lithograph. You can see they don't appear to me to be impoverished. I would say definitely bourgeois. And where they're promenading is where people promenade today on the Primorsky Boulevard. I'm almost certain, although it was much more wooded apparently then than it is now, although it's famously shaded with the acacia trees of the Primorsky Boulevard right here. I'm sorry, the allergies are getting to me. Just looking at those trees. So, clearly, by the 30s, as I've already indicated, wealth has come to Odessa. This is a synagogue built by merchants, and they had enough money to hire Morandi, the Italian architect. You can see it's quite grand and quite beautiful. And it's a symbol of how the early settlement of Jews apparently prospered, that they could collect enough money. And we know that there were kosher butchers, and as early as 1802, there was a hospital, Jewish hospital, where even non-Jews could get free treatment if necessary. So the city prospered along the Greeks and the Italians, and some of the other immigrants, of course, prospered as well. But another indication is another synagogue, the Brodsky Synagogue, again, this is Florentine Gothic style, and it was large and quite beautifully constructed. And it's right downtown, down the center of the city as well. And this is the interior. And here I must interject that in 1981, I was the first American exchange professor with Odessa. Nobody had ever asked to go to Odessa before. And when I got there, nobody knew what to do with me. But that's another situation. I was allowed into the archives, and one day I'm reading about the Brodsky Synagogue, interior, exterior, and then I'm looking around and I said, oh my goodness, I'm in the Brodsky. I felt I was profanation of the sacred space, but there I was. And presumably, you know, the archivists were there were tables around. So in the Soviet period, first they converted the Brodsky Synagogue into a workers' club, I understand, and then into the Oblast archives. I might say incidentally, that at present, they're emptying the synagogue of the archives. They don't know what to do now with the archives, but they've promised to restore the synagogue to the Jewish community. Now here we are at last in Moldavanka. Of course, I chose the pretty pictures, which romanticizes a lot of poverty, I'm sure. But on the other hand, some of us have an impression, but nothing but crime and violence and abject poverty existed in Moldavanka, and that's not true, I don't think either. You know, they were cramped and poor Jewish families, but they led fairly normal lives, not entirely lives of desperation. So if this looks kind of pretty, so be it. And this is another view, characteristic of Moldavanka. It still exists, of course. It never was entirely Jewish, I might say, because in Odessa there was no ghetto. The ethnic groups were segregated by wealth. If you were a Jewish wealthy person, you could live right alongside a wealthy Greek or Italian, so that the distribution of groups, including Jews, was according to wealth, and conversely, there were poor people in Moldavanka, but it was primarily Jewish. Now, I'm curious to know whether that outdoor furniture, it's certainly not going out to the Salvation Army, but it shows a certain level of trust of it to be out there in public. It's cramped, kind of cozy. A lot of it was run down then, run down now. Famous kind of courtyards that are typical of Odessa houses, not just of Moldavanka, I might say. Here's a modern, you can see now this is kind of almost middle class with decent cars. This I had to. What I like about it is the ingenuity of the recycling and of course the optimism of the flowers. Now here we see, you know, with the leopard skin and the broken windows and so forth, a genuinely rundown section of Moldavanka. Forgive me for spending so much time on that, but so much of the Russian literature, Jewish literature, involves Moldavanka. I thought I should, those of you who have not been there, to give you the experience of being in Moldavanka. So, before we go into culture, I'm still lingering a bit in the commercial aspects of Odessa, because the change of commercial fortune is very significant, and I'll try to be brief about it, because I'm afraid I'm already taking up too much time, so I better hurry up. The short version is, as I suggested, in the first half of the century, Jews prospered, some more than others, but generally there was an opportunity there, not just in the foreign trade, and actually the Jewish firms, by and large, were small. Well, they weren't even companies so much as individual Jews and family engaged as brokers and middlemen. It was the Jews that went out in the countryside and took the risk of bargaining with the peasants and the landlords for the next crop. So it was, as I say, a kind of buying into futures, and you had to have a certain amount of capital. You had to bear the risk of what the crop might be like and what the market would demand, domestically and especially abroad. But the Jews, having lived in the shtetls and in that Pale of settlement, knew the Russian, Ukrainian peasants, knew how to the languages, understood the economics of the region, and then they would have to then go and bargain with the exporters, the big Greek or the Italian firms, how much they were going to get for their crop. So it was very complicated, and they, but a large number did prosper, and probably the most significant in terms of wealth was the Ufrizi family. The Ufrizis were so wealthy, they had the largest, even bigger than the Greeks and the Italians, exporting company. One son even had his own bank in Odessa. The other sons went to Vienna, Paris, they moved their branches of the family, Athens, London. I know. Be sure to read The Hair of the Amber. I see a lot of people nodding. It's a history of the Ufrizi family. It's beautiful, and it's written by a descendant. I can give you the name for interest. I won't take the time now. But the Ufrizi is an example of super rich Jewish commercial opportunity, but the middling was more typical. But even the significance of the Crimean War should not be lost. That was the gist of my dissertation. The significance of the Crimean War and altering the commercial fortunes of Odessa. Although in absolute numbers, commerce increased after the Crimean War, the share of the Black Sea trade diminished, and I'll explain in a minute why. But that's the most important thing. And then even within the Black Sea ports, Odessa was reduced disproportionately to its size, and I'll explain that. Now, why did the Crimean War affect trade? Well, simply because the Turks closed the strait for 3 years. And Italians had to make their pasta, and the French had to make their French bread. The British had to have flour and wheat as well. So they turned to America principally, to Canada, to Argentina and India too, but mainly to the United States. The United States could produce clean wheat cheaply. The Erie Canal and other infrastructure facilitated that. And furthermore, the Americans were able to devise a process to export flour, not have it damp and moldy. And unfortunately in Odessa, although eventually they were able to do that, they weren't as able to do it as quickly as the Americans. So the European market was pretty satisfied with the American wheat, and so a lot of them stuck with them even after the reopening of the Black Sea. Now, why would Odessa lose, especially in this race? Well, because by that time, after the middle of the 19th century, the government had changed significantly. In the early years, just to summarize extremely briefly, the administrators were at first enlightened Europeans, like the Duc de Richelieu and his successor, Langeron, and then even the first Russian administrator, Vorontsov, Pushkin called him Milord, that intimating that he really wasn't Russian at all, so that he had grown up in the court of St. James, where his father was the Russian ambassador to England. So at any rate, you had enlightened and benign rulers, administrators of Odessa and New Russia, who were very tolerant of every ethnic group and religion, and furthermore, they had tight connections with the monarchy. They could go to St. Petersburg, say, we need this, and they got it. So the conjuncture of fortunes between the demand and the supply and the favoritism of the central government before the Crimean War is really remarkable, and it makes, I think, well, clearly it boosted Odessa into its rank of being such a primary commercial city. But afterwards, as they say, and it wasn't noticeable, of course, there was a gradual decline in the trade, and most of the Italian firms just simply pulled out. They went back to Livorno and all their other ports and forgot about Odessa. The Greek firms were more diverse. The Greeks assimilated more easily into the Russian because of religion and intermarried, and some of the tycoons, let's call them, disinvested from grain and foreign commerce and invested in real estate. So they had choice real estate in Odessa, and I followed that through the land sales. But at any rate, the decline of the grain trade, the pulling out of the big firms, left a vacuum, so the Jewish former middlemen become the exporters themselves. All along, Jews had exported, but mostly textiles, ironware, clothes, shoes, petty kind of trade. But now, somebody still had to supply grain to the world at large, and Jews did it, but they did it in small companies, even just individuals. So there was a proliferation of Jewish firms, not as profitable, except as to say the exception of Aphrusi was a remarkable exception. And the perception was in some quarters and even written that the Jews were pushing the Greeks out. And whereas in fact there was a vacuum and the Greeks took up the slack of this, so in a way this kind of explains some of the pogroms, which we may discuss in question and answer time, if you like. But so keep in mind that there was a change, not a sudden change, but a gradual change, and the Jewish fortunes changed along with it. Now we have the community I've already described, but briefly it was hard, except for pogroms. In some instances it was a big exception, but the most violent ones were after the Crimean War. In fact, that is connected with what I've just been remarking. So now let's move quickly into culture before you won't agree with Woody Allen. He said, in what was Love and Death, the movie, well, you probably don't remember, but I do, because he said, wheat, glorious wheat, the spoof on War and Peace. But anyway, we're leaving the wheat right now and going into culture. We'll start with music now. The klezmer musicians, as you can see, they're not in uniform. Presumably it's an ad hoc group, each playing a different instrument, improvising, playing at weddings and fairs, and other celebratory occasions. And of course, that gave rise to the claim that actually the Jewish musicians of Odessa invented jazz. New Orleans has a problem with that. But Leonid Utoza, he was a jazz singer, but he actually made the claim, maybe tongue in cheek, that not the black Americans, but the Odessa Jews, he was from Odessa, who invented jazz. And there's part of the street furniture in Odessa. Odessa's full. Not going to be room for pedestrians anymore. There's so many delightful, generally humorous statues such as that. April 1st, of course, being the city's national holiday, in Marina, it's fantastic. The city goes all out, and every year, if at that time, they plan another memorial. So as I say, there are lots of them. Before we discuss the writers, how much time is left?
20.
Huh?
20.
Plenty, okay. I'll stop racing it. I know this thing is gonna be yanked from me. So, that's an inside joke. One of the distinguished members of the audience has loaned me this connector, and she has to leave. So
Don't worry about it, don't worry, we'll skip.
there may be a little scuffle here. Oh, okay. So, Odessa, apart from being known for its humor and its jazz, is known for its music. You know, a lot of Jews, the poor Jews had organs, and they were organ grinders, some with monkeys, some without. You know, I'm so old that even in San Francisco, we had organ grinders with monkeys when I was a little girl. So I can relate to the monkey grinders of Odessa. But apart from that, the Italian merchants, of course, they didn't put up synagogues. They did put up a church that became a gym. But anyway, they had their theater and the opera, Odessa's opera. It had opera, or good opera, even before Moscow. The theater was built in the 20s and 30s, the first one. It burnt down. But the Italian merchants brought over divas from Italy, conductors. It was huge, you know. Again, Pushkin and again, Onegin mentions how he enjoyed the opera in Odessa. The premiere of Barbara of Seville and William Tell and many others were shown in Odessa first. And of course, pious Jews were shocked that Jews went to the profane opera. As a matter of fact, it was so popular with some of the Jewish population that they formed factions supporting one diva against the other. And they were known to come to fisticuffs at the opera itself, you know, shouting, you know, who was the bravissima. So the musical tradition was very strong. The cantors in Odessa were supposedly the best in the world. Whether they were influenced by the tenors of the opera, I'm not sure. Odessa is known for its school of violin music, which is still, if there are any musicians here, you can enlighten us why it's still popular. There was this famous Stoyarsky music school, and Babel, in one of his Odessa stories, semi-autobiographical, talks about how Jewish fathers made lottery out of their young sons. He calls them little Jewish dwarfs dressed in velvet suits and lace collars and patent leather shoes. The fathers hoping to invest in a prodigy who will get to St. Petersburg and make a fortune. And in his story, this little boy, presumably Babel himself, was a truant. He didn't want to learn the violin. He could barely listen to the screeching from his little instrument. So he went naturally to the beach. This was fine until Stolarski himself came to the house and said, where is he? Well, the father was so enraged that little Bobo ran to the laboratory and locked himself in it. And of course, his grandmother rescued him finally from this predicament. Many famous violinists, Misha Elman, David Ostreich, among others, came from Odessa, and it's still known, as they say, for its music. There could be a photography. The first photographic studio was in Odessa, and the Jews were involved. And certainly in the movie-making industry, Odessa was, for a while, like the Hollywood of the Russian Empire because of the good light and the beautiful scenery, and presumably, the creative spirit of the city as well. Now, this is where I get into Maxime's territory. So I'm going over
Give it
one
back to me.
slightly. I mean, chutzpah I've got, but that much I'm not sure. Here, I am not a literary historian, as I've just made my confession, but I do try to answer why Jewish writers came to Odessa. What was it about the city that appealed to them? I'm not sure I have the answer yet. I'm still working on it, but the progress report is, well, simply for one thing, because of the environment and the cultural environment and the ethos that had developed in this city. Geographically, it was far removed from St. Petersburg. So the center authorities, which wasn't really so central, had a very tenuous grasp on the people, the residents of Odessa, especially since they had delegated so much power to the early rulers. There never really was a tight tether on Odessite, and they took advantage of this freedom. They were more audacious in their writing and in every way more individualistic, more secular for the most part, not just Jews, but even the Orthodox were known apparently for their lack of interest in religion. So the sense of freedom and the actual detachment from central authorities and the defiance of central authorities. One of the reasons why the central authorities, they said, treated Odessa so shabbily, well, for one thing, it was the center of national conspiracies and uprisings. As early as 1821, the Greeks had plotted to their independence. Then the Poles, and after all, there were a lot of Poles in Odessa, including the former Polish Jews, but the Polish nationalists. And when they had the amazing rebellion of '63, it was considered that Odessa had been a kind of seedbed for that revolt. It was part of the punishment. The Bulgarians, Ukrainians, and the Decembrists, the Russian revolt. So there's something about the city, its remoteness, for one thing, and its independent spirit. It was perceived, and in fact, was a kind of revolutionary. So any kind of writer or intellectual or thinker who wanted to get away either from a stultifying atmosphere of a shtetl perhaps, or from the capitals, Moscow and St. Petersburg, wanted to go until having a nucleus of writers seemed to draw others there. For instance, I'm looking at Bialik, the young poet. He went principally because Svarim or Abramovich was there. So if you have a certain critical mass of writers, it quite logically is going to attract others. And here's a group we don't, well, but this is 1905, we've already gotten fairly modern. And there's another group, there is Moshe Sforim. Am I pronouncing that right?
Perfect.
Yeah, just like a good Irish girl.
No, better than that.
1910. So in my survey in the book, I lay it out that the Jewish writers of Odessa wrote in either Hebrew, Yiddish, or Russian, and I divided it into periodical press and fiction largely. And so then the problem is, to answer the question, why did they choose one or the other of the three languages? And it becomes, and I'm sure it's clear to people who are expert in the field, that the Jews of Odessa who chose Hebrew were rather alarmed at the lack of Hebrew speech, of course, on the street, and that was obvious. Most of the Jews spoke Yiddish, and of course, almost all of them spoke Russian, since they had such close associations physically and economically with Russians. But Hebrew was chosen by the intellectuals, in most instances, kind of the elites, those who were alarmed at the spread of Russian and even Yiddish, wanted to stop Yiddish as being the national language, and nationalists, and ultimately Zionists. And I don't know, maybe in the question and answer period we can get into individuals. I had thought of talking about individuals, but I think that's going fast. With regard to Hebrew, then there were periodicals that were very precocious in so far as the Advocate was the first journal in 1860, but then after the pogrom of 71, it picked up and went to St. Petersburg. There were the Lovers and Zion. They were giving up on emancipation. The more the Jewish intellectuals gave up on emancipation, acculturation, and the more they turned toward Zionism, just to summarize it. As far as the fiction is concerned, the Hebrew textbooks were printed in Odessa and distributed all over Europe. Some fiction was written in the periodicals, Levinsky, who wrote the first science fiction about this paradisical utopian settlement in Palestine, sets it in 2040. We're getting up there. That was serialized in periodicals. The Zionists, the World Zionist Organization weekly paper, The World, was published just before World War I in Odessa. So in all, in the 40 years before World War I, there were 13 Hebrew periodicals published in Odessa. The last one was in 1919. Of course, the Soviets stopped it all. Hebrew fiction, I've already mentioned Abramovich, was penning, was Moshe Sforim. He wrote in Hebrew, though he's known as the grandfather of Yiddish literature, but he wrote a lot in Hebrew. Ultimately, he translated a lot of his Yiddish writing into Hebrew. He's given the credit of shaping modern Hebrew language and basing it, well, he's part of the modern literary style, as I understand it, Nusa, because it's based on Islam, Talmudic, biblical, and vernacular literature, speech. And he does, even in Hebrew fiction, depict ordinary Odessa life. The Library of Collection of Jewish Books in Odessa was named after him, but it was, that lasted actually until World War II, when the Romanian Nazis destroyed it. Yeah, there are other writers, as I say, that I think I will there were poets, of course, National Renaissance. Bialik, as already mentioned, he did write about the Pope Roman Chisinau, 1903, the city of slaughter. He went to Tel Aviv in 1924 and became Israel's national poet. So certainly the Zionism, Palestine, ultimately Israel, has a direct connection with Odessa through a lot of literary production and writers. Now, a lot of you, I'm sure, are acquainted with Shalom Aleichem. He's called the Jewish Mark Twain there. He almost looks like Mark Twain with the mustache and the haircut. He, well, of course, Fiddler on the Roof. It's famous to most Americans, but he wrote a lot more than that. But his connection with Odessa is not very deep. I mean, he didn't come from Odessa, he wasn't born there. He's really associated with Odessa for 2 years of his life. He lived in Kiev and other places, but his wife was wealthy, and he went to Odessa to gamble her fortune, apparently, on the stock market. And I might say that the Birja in Odessa was the first stock market in all of the Russian Empire. The first decade of Odessa's history, they had a stock market. And unfortunately, he lost, so he had a bad experience in Odessa, but he did write there, and he did write about it, especially in his fictional letters to his wife describing Odessa, which are really quite humorous. I recommend them. Here's where he lived in Odessa. You can see he was not in the Moldavanka. But it's funny, I guess he was living comparatively high on the hog because he lost the money. And there's a plaque on the house that mentions the time that he was in I think it does, does it say? Okay. So, there's so much more to be said about him. He did go to America, and he died there of tuberculosis. His funeral was huge. Those of you who teach this subject can expatiate on that for me, if you like. There's more of the street art, but this actually is painted there in Odessa in one of the entrance to the courtyard. Jabotinsky. Now, he was an Odessa, born there. He left Odessa as a teenager to go to Naples and became an Italian common correspondent in Italy. So he was very involved initially in the press, and he wrote in Yiddish. He was humorous. He could be humorous, but he wasn't always humorous. He was an activist in addition to being an orator. Oh, he was a soldier too. He joined the British. Pardon?
It's hard to run. Someone's talking at the same time.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Someone over there is talking, and it's kind of, I can't keep.
Oh, okay.
Thanks for pointing that out.
Jabotinsky is one of my favorites. I love The Five, because it doesn't describe the crooks and the thieves. Like, your type of people. Not that I have anything against smugglers and thieves, but what I like about it is that he did choose the bourgeois, and of course, I suppose I must be bourgeois, at least by now. I'm working on it. I'm climbing up the social mobility fast as I can. Okay, thank you, okay. Well, but then I can't go on and on about Jabotinsky, one of my favorites. But read the 5, if you haven't, you must read it. It's a metaphor, I think, for the dissolution of the Jewish society in Odessa. Everybody, no one is terribly poor, but they all come to an unhappy end. And of course, that is what he's promoting, is Zionism. And he's very interesting as a writer as far as I'm concerned. Though I'm rapidly going through the pages here. I think, let's see, okay, what we gotta do, him. Babel. There he is as a boy. He went to the Nicholas I Gymnasium, which shows already that he was from a bourgeois family. He didn't go to religious school, although they had Orthodox religious training, but he learned the foreign languages. He knew quite a few foreign languages, not as many as Jabotinsky, but Babel wrote in Yiddish, Hebrew, and Russian. When he was a teenager, he actually wrote in French short stories in the style of Guy de Maupassant, Gustave Flaubert. And there he is nearing his unhappy demise in 1940, the hands of the Soviets for his bourgeois cosmopolitan writing. There's one of his memorials. The garden of the Literary Museum of Odessa is full of them. I think that's not quite in the garden, but I'm not sure where that is, to tell you the truth. I thought it was the Literary Museum, the rear of it on the approach to the garden. You can see it's pensive and sad. All right. Now this I have to throw in, Gambrinus, which was a short story written by a Russian, Kuprin. But on my way to the university library, I passed the original spot of Gambrinus. I'm not sure that this modern Gambrinus is actually there, but I'd like to pretend it is. But it does have the flavor. It certainly looks more spruced up and clean than the tragic story of Gambrinus by Kuprin, in which you have Sanka, the Jewish fiddler, who is mutilated in a pogrom but changes instruments according to the capacity of his, losing an arm. Couldn't play the fiddle, but he could play the fife, so to speak. So anyway, it's a wonderful story, a shocking one, about the Sanka, the Jewish fiddler. Back to music again. Ilfin Petrov. Well, I'm not sure which little boy he is in that. I assume he's not the little girl in the front. He's described as coming from a poor working family. Well, they might be their Sabbath best, but they look certainly respectable. He teamed up with this Russian Petrov, was really Katayev. Ilfis Feinzelberg. He was a journalist, and the comedy writers of Ilf and Petrov reached their zenith with depicting the NEP years, 1921, for when capitalism was allowed, or aspects of capitalism was allowed, which of course any Odessite would find hilarious because capitalism never died, not even the Soviet period, even for the smuggling time. in Odessa, so that having a spoof in the 12 Chairs, maybe some of you saw the 1970 movie, the 12 Chairs, in which this aristocrat and Ostap Bender, who is more of a rogue than Bavos Benya Creek, who's a real gangster. But anyway, Ostap Bender and the aristocrat are trying to find the 12 chairs with the jewels sewn into them that have been dispersed through society. And there's an Orthodox priest who's also on the chase. I can't help but laugh at thinking of it. So that's one of, there he is with his partner on the right, Petrov. Ilf has the glasses. And here are two again of the street and monuments of Odessa, memorializing the 12 chairs and the Golden Calf, journey by automobile to Chernomorsk, which obviously Odessa, it's very humorous too, I recommend it. So they both Ilf and Petrov left Odessa for Moscow after the revolution. Odessa was not where you wanted to be. You wanted to be in Odessa. So there's a general decline in the literary circles after the revolution in Odessa. Now, we're coming rapidly to the very worst part of Odessa's history, World War II. As I say, the Romanians were designated occupiers of Odessa, and there were at first reprisals for the burning down of the headquarters of the military, the Nazi headquarters there. So some of the Jewish population perished in that situation. 100 Jews for every soldier, 200 Jews for every officer. Others were deported to nearby camps or died en route or in the camps or were shot in the camps. So as there were 200,000 Jews, and when the Nazis entered and when the Soviet troops liberated Odessa, supposedly only 48 Jews were left. So, yeah, for all of its history, it culminated in this terrible Holocaust, and there are these monuments to it. I did get the spacing very well here, forgive me. So a good many of the Odessa writers in particular, some of them came from the shtetls and then wrote Yiddish stories about the shtetls, as we've seen, Alechem, Shalom Alechem, for example. Others then left Odessa for Moscow or for Palestine or for the United States or elsewhere. But almost all of them have a sense of longing, a sense of nostalgia, for Odessa. And so I guess I'm trying to get you on an upper a little bit, yeah. Thank you. I think my time's up.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Pat, thank you so much for this beautiful overview. I just want to say, we'll have time for questions, but some of you came in a little late, and allow me just to say again that this is the 7th and last event in our series of lectures and symposia under the auspices of the project on Russian and Eurasian Jewry that was made possible with a very generous grant by Genesis Philanthropy Group. That's one. Two, specifically about Patricia, that the book, Odessa Recollected, that we're celebrating today, is out. There are representatives of Academic Studies Press here. They have an order form. The book is physically not here, but it is here metaphysically. You can also order it, and it's a very, very attractive discount. So allow me to direct your attention to that as well. And Again, I am so happy that you were able to share these wonderful thoughts and observations with us. And with that in mind, we'll take some questions if
Sure.
Pat doesn't mind it.
You speak loudly.
Yeah, I ask just for one thing that you please identify yourselves when you ask questions, please. Yes.
Evelyn Arthur, I'm curious to hear about Odessa after the revolution. After the revolution of 1917, what happened with the Jewish population?
What happened to Odessa
And
after the
Jewish
revolution?
population.
Well, there were 78 synagogues and they all were destroyed along with prayer houses. All of the Jewish press, obviously, was gone. There was, oddly enough, you might say, a window of what deceptive freedom before Stalin came to power, right after the revolution. Let's say Odessa wasn't taken until 1920 or so. So between 1919 and 1927, just before Stalin, this Pale of Settlement was gone. Actually, that left before the revolution, but nonetheless. So in a sense, emancipation had come. There were no longer the Ignatiev laws, which I didn't have time to discuss because I rhapsodized over that. The Ignatiev law, in a negative sense, because that really prompted Jews to be regarded as second-class citizens. They were defined as second-class citizens. The Ignatiev laws of 1882 on the heels of the assassination of the Tsar of 81, so that's a factor. But the point is that part of the drive toward Zion was because of what happened in the 1880s. And so within 20, 40 years, to have this end of the Pale of Settlement, the end of the Ignatiev laws, there were no more civil disabilities. In the heyday of the Jewish experience in Odessa, there was no numerous clauses at the university. Jews went up from being petty traders into being doctors, lawyers, dentists, engineers, professional people. They could go to the university in Odessa and did go, but then after 1880, only 5% of the Jewish population was admitted. So the fact that all of these disabilities just disappeared, the Pale of Settlement disappeared, and before the presses were closed, it looked like total freedom. And a lot of Jews at this time had already become Bolsheviks. Well, actually, there were more Mensheviks proportionally than Bolsheviks among the Jewish Marxists. There were other kinds of socialists, the Bundists, labor leaders, and so on. So they looked upon the revolution as a kind of final liberation and path to happiness. Well, of course, as we've seen, it ended differently.
Please.
One of the explanation I heard for the decline of Jews throughout the Pale and the Russian Empire was actually otherwise perhaps positive development of releasing the serfs, so their position as middlemen between large land owners and the peasants vanished. Did this affect the Jews of Odessa who were in the trade and in being middlemen?
What about that?
The release of the serfs.
The emancipation of the Serbs, he's asking whether there was a connection between that and the role of Jewish entrepreneurs.
I don't see a direct connection. Certainly, the atmosphere of the 60s was generally positive among Jews as well as the population. They thought it was the beginning of liberalization. But of course, as the emancipation turned out to be, the serfs were serfs cum peasants, as peasants, were not that liberated, but we can't go into that. But the middlemen occupation was, I don't think, dependent on whether there was serfdom or not. It was, how are you gonna get the grain? And whether they were produced by peasants or
Didn't matter.
serfs. And the landlords would be the same entities. I don't see the connection.
That makes a lot of sense. Yes, please.
Elizabeth Wood, I have a question about the famous Odessa Jewish humor.
Oh,
And,
yes.
if you have a thought about why it would be, why
Yeah.
is Odessa famous for?
Well,
I mean, it's
let's,
a basic question, but I'm curious.
well, let's say that humor is not in scarcity among Jews in general. And I direct you to Jeremy Dauber's book on Jewish humor. I was trying to find the answer to that, Elizabeth, myself. So I concluded that Jews were going to have satirical humor in particular, you know, and maybe this is where I see the analogy with the Irish. The minority status, you know, life is what it is, you can't change it, might as well laugh at it. So at any rate, so I would say that. Now, why in Odessa? Well, again, there was a greater outdoor life. People talked more outdoors. They were huddled up in the houses in Moscow, or as we are in New England. You know, they're in the courtyard exchanging banter and jokes. The opera and the theater tradition was huge. So people like Shavanansky, you know, famous humorists. In fact, a lot of the Borscht Belt here that have Odessa comedians or Odessa type comedians, they assume Odessa lingo and idiom and intonation and so forth. So that, I think that's part of it. Also the fact that the people who came to Odessa were outsiders. They might have come from the shtetl into the town, and they might have, like Shalom Aleichem, come from Kiev into Odessa. And what is taken for granted by natives is observed, and some of it is quirky and humorous and different. And so I think it sharpens your perception of differences, which can be the basis of humor as well. It's a tough question, and I'm still in search.
Please.
I'd like to know, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I'd like to know a little bit about those who left, who left Odessa around about the turn of the century. How complicated was it to leave in terms of obtaining visas? Happened to include my great-great-grandfather came to England at the turn of the 20th century.
Yes, well, the pogroms would be the pogrom in 1905 in particular began the exodus to various places, America and England and Palestine, of course. So, and again, the withering of the grain trade, but pogroms in particular, the revolutionaries were perceived as being, if not Jews, Jewish instigated, the 1905 revolution. So the nexus between revolution and pogrom is very tight, and that the exodus. But as I say, I know a lot, yeah, I know, let's say a lot of Jewish emigres from Odessa, and they really miss it, you know. It was a horrible place for them in the 70s. And I've visited refuseniks in Odessa, but the ones that got away miss it, and a lot of who left rather, and very often tend to go back. And the Jewish community in the population now is only 3% of Odessa, give or take. There hasn't been a census in Ukraine since 2001, so nobody really knows how many Jews, you know, well, anyway, it's all very vague. But the point is that even the emigres who had no liking for the Russian Empire or the Bolsheviks or the Stalinists are trying to build up the Jewish community in Odessa, you know.
Was it easy to get visas? Was it easy to obtain visas for those who wanted them?
And it was never legal to leave.
Yeah.
No, you just left. You had, 12 Jewish writers' families left. 19, when was it? 20, Maxim. They left for Constantinople.
Well, Odessa was one of the few places that you could get on a boat sailed to
Yeah.
Constantinople and then to Jaffa. So of course, this is one of the routes, the principal
Yeah.
route of immigration, right?
Yeah.
In fact, many people would pass through Odessa and stay there for a period of time
Right.
before they would sail to the British Mandate
Yeah.
of Palestine. And that was a large critical mass of the Chalutzim went this way, actually.
Yes.
They were not all Odessans, of
Yeah.
course.
Right, no, it was a way to stop.
Yeah. Pat, I have one question, if I may. So, of course, you made a beautiful case for Odessa as a place where many Jewish writers came from or were formed.
Yes.
Jewish writers who wrote principally in Hebrew, in Yiddish, and in Russian.
Mm-hmm.
You've also done a ton of work on Odessa's economic history.
Mm.
So I want to probe this just a little bit. There is this peculiar argument in Russian cultural history, actually, and it goes back to the work of a very unknown emigre scholar, Russian-American scholar called Elizabeth Malazyomov, who wrote a dissertation at Berkeley right before World War II, in which she argued, it's a fascinating work, which was never published, that if you look at the 19th century and where the Russian writers come from, practically a critical mass of them come from 4 provinces in the southern central area of Russia: Voronezh, Oryol, Tambov, and Kursk, which is the black soil belt. And her argument was that people like Turgenev, Spassky, Utagin, Bunin, her argument was that these were prosperous areas, and for some reason or other, they seem to have yielded a lot of families that could afford a certain amount of leisure for their children or a certain amount of money. So my question is, do you think this argument holds for Odessa and the paradox of how many Jewish writers come from Odessa?
Yeah, because of the wealth. Yeah, well, there really was, I mean, upward mobility at the time that there weren't political and legal disabilities imposed on them. So you can trace that. Yeah, definitely, I think there is something to that. You know, wealth equals education above all. Education yields literacy, obviously, and let me make my own bold proposal, but I think it's not original. And that is that it was the Jews who Russified Odessa, because there were very few native Russian authors from Odessa. So more books were published by Jews in Russian than published in Russian. So in that sense, you had to read Russian to get the good literature from good writers, and they were Jewish principally. Who were the Russians in Odessa? Well, they were the military coterie, the administrators sometimes, the bureaucrats. They were not wealthy, they weren't attracted there, they were just mostly plopped there, and they had nothing to write about, apparently. So I do think there is a connection, whether it's a trigger, direct trigger, but the ambiance. I'd like to read that. I'm a Berkeley graduate myself.
Right. No, I think there's a lot to that, and in fact,
But not before World War II.
people always remember Pavel and Zhabotinsky or Bagritsky, but people often forget Pasternak almost became an Odessan writer. Do you know this?
No, I didn't
Yeah,
know.
he was born in Moscow, but his parents had just moved from Odessa because his father
This
was
is your
hired.
Bagritsky.
No,
You're not-
Pasternak. I'm talking about Boris Pasternak. He's,
Yes.
yeah, and had
Well,
life.
wait a minute, his father is
Exactly.
buried in Odessa.
Exactly, had life turned out a little differently. It was a
Yeah.
matter of 2 years
Yeah.
and luck, and his father's great talent. His father never converted, of course. So
His father was an artist.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So basically, he was almost. That's my point.
Well, that-
Born in Odessa.
Well, that's what Jabotinsky said. He said, I was born in Odessa, you'd think I'm bragging. Everyone would like to be born in Odessa.
That's right. That's right. So I think we have time for maybe a couple of questions. Please.
I'm Eileen O'Neill. I was really struck by your comment that Odessa is so distant from the Russian imperial center, right? From St. Petersburg, distant from Moscow. And yet even people who go to Moscow and go to St. Petersburg feel very close to Odessa, right? There's this sense of nostalgia, there's this cultural connection. So if we're trying to figure out where to place Odessa, geographical proximity probably isn't the way to do it. So I would love to hear you explain, where should we place Odessa in history? Is it do you think of it, does it belong in the space of Russian history, Jewish history, Greek history, Italian history, maritime history, economic, it's connected to so many places through so many forms of interaction. What is the space of, where do you place Odessa in history?
Let me pretend I'm an Odessite. I do belong to the International Club of Odessite. Me and Stallone, Sylvester Stallone. Well, anyway, but as an Odessite, I would claim Odessa as my space. First of all, as said, not only in the writing, but even in population, they were more than the Russians themselves up until almost the end of the at certain points of development. Even as late as 1897, well, it would go by language, 35% were Jewish, and not even 50% were Slavic. But then throw in the Poles and the Ukrainians and the Russian, Slavic speaking. So but as an Odessite, I'd say that the pox on all your houses. We resist the Russians. They think we're conspirators. Well, okay, we are conspirators. Leave us alone. Give us our free city. Don't give us any of your laws. We'll manage things ourselves. Even the Soviets, when I was living there in '81 in the dormitory, it was clear that Odessa was low on the pecking order of the Soviet system because of the lack of food. Kiev had more, Moscow and St. Petersburg had even more, even though in the time of shortage. So the Odessite, and they give everybody trouble, they don't, everyone's suspicious of them. The Russian Empire didn't trust them and punished them, as they said. The Russian Empire started investing in Nikolaev as opposed to Odessa, started making the train tariffs more favorable to Nikolaev. Now, how can you punish your own city? If the government doesn't feel that Odessa is part of your empire, why should they feel they're part of the Russians? At the moment, of course, there's extensive Ukrainianization of Odessa linguistically and otherwise, because by now the Russified language speaking people, they kind of resent this in their perception of change. So Ukraine is not don't know exactly how iffy this in national terms. So, they would like to, I think, to be an island floating out without any custom duties, and be their own little kingdom. So it depends on the viewer where you place this space. But as an Odessite, you're a resistor. I'll take it.
Yeah, please.
I'm curious if you can elaborate a little more on anti-Semitism within Odessa. I'm especially curious between when, towards the end of the 19th century up to the time of the Holocaust, and how you mentioned the Greeks remaining.
The Greeks.
And the view that the Jews then were overtaking the Greeks, right? Something like that.
Yeah, the Greeks left the business and the Jews took up the slack. So there's a lot of economic, but there was also real.
So to the extent where the Jews maybe moving up, what was compared to the rest of Odessa, and what was their friction because of this?
Right, well, there was friction because of the attractiveness, the magnet qualities of Odessa to Jews at a certain point, later in the 19th century. In other words, this saying to live like God in Odessa, people actually believe that, diamonds on the street, just like the gold rush in San Francisco. And when they got there, especially the uneducated, who wanted to be longshoremen, a lot of Jews were in longshoremen business, so to speak, loading the ships. They had to compete with the poor Ukrainians and the poor Russians. So at that lower level, there was a lot of tension, economic, but it could be easily, Jews. There's always kind of a substratum of anti-Semitism, whether based on religion but economic friction seemed to be one of the triggers that would erupt in the pogroms. So I would never say that never was any anti-Semitic. There's always this latent. And if you notice the chronology of many of the pogroms, it was an Easter week. The Orthodox Christians have gone 40 days without food, and meat, rather, or protein, meat, fish, and whatnot, and vodka. And once that vodka hit, all hell broke loose, and we have pogroms. So it took triggers. I'm saying some of them are religious, some are economic, some are just everyday life, like eating and drinking and not eating and drinking. But compared to other cities, but of course there was no comparison because Odessa was unique. How will I answer this? There was always some anti-Semitic, but didn't manifest itself, at least in the first half of the 19th century, I would argue.
Thank you. Pat, thank you so much. We're getting